Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. There are a handful of topics that animate much of my work and run through the DNA of this show. The intersection of theory and practice, the overlaps of design practices and writing practices, teaching and pedagogy, how design relates to politics and society, and administration as a creative practice. And there is perhaps no one better in the design world today who embodies all of these interests of mine than my guest today, Sarah Whiting. Since 2019, Sarah has served as the Dean of the Harvard GSD. She's also the co-founder and design principal of WW Architects, has written for a variety of publications and journals from Any to Wired, and has served as editor for a variety of publications, books, and anthologies, including serving as the reviews editor for the journal Assemblage from 96 to 2001. From 2010 to 2019, she was the dean at Rice University School of Architecture. Sarah is one of those dream guests that I've wanted on the show for a really long time. I remember stumbling upon an essay of hers called Notes from the Doppler Effect and Other Moods of Modernism when I was just beginning this show. And in many ways, the ideas of that piece and Sarah's own thinking hover over so much of my work. In this wide-ranging conversation, we talk about the expanding opportunities for designers, the role of conversation in her work, how being a dean shapes her research, why editing is critical to her practice, how to connect form and theory in the classroom, and the value of design criticism in contemporary culture. I think you'll be able to tell how much I enjoyed this one. It truly felt like talking with a kindred spirit, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. If you'd rather read this interview, a transcript for this episode, as with all of our episodes, is available to Patreon supporters. Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you who help support the show each month through our Patreon. Supporters get bonus interviews, an exclusive monthly newsletter, and more. Students can support the show for just $3 a month, and we offer additional tiers at $5 and $10 a month for additional content. Head over to patreon.com/Surface Podcast to sign up and get immediate access to all of that bonus material. Thank you, as always, for listening. And here is my wonderful conversation with Sarah Whiting. I want to start with a question that is maybe a really big question and a really weird question, but I think it might frame a lot of what I'm interested in talking to you about. Since 2019, you've been the dean at Harvard GSD, and GSD famously or infamously to some people stands for the Graduate School of Design as opposed to architecture. And I'm wondering if that name, what that means to you or how that influences your mandate as dean, running a school of design as opposed to a school of architecture. Does that have an influence on how you think about your work?
No, it's actually a very great question, a very pertinent one, because it's a big change going from, so I was dean of a school of architecture at Rice for almost 10 years. And that was not only a school of architecture, but essentially a one department school that was quite small and so quite contained. And so I have to consciously think I'm a dean of a school of design as opposed, because it's very easy for me to say, yeah, I'm dean at the GSD, the School of Architecture. And I have to catch myself on that because obviously this is a school with 3 departments. So architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning and design, and then a series of programs in addition to those 3 departments, including design engineering, which is in partnership with the School of Design, School of Engineering, and then the Master of Design Studies, which we can talk about as a sort of interdisciplinary platform. So there's a lot going on here, and that was actually part of my desire to come here. So I think deans and magazines have a 10-year lifespan. Of really doing good things and then become a little bit redundant or repetitive.
Interesting.
And so it was a good time to move on, and moving on to a school that had the 3 departments and a broader mandate was exciting to me. So there's that reason. And then I would say the second thing is that I think what it does is allow for understanding that, honestly, I think all design is synthetic and interdisciplinary. And so it somewhat acknowledges that. I think at Rice, frankly, it's a school of architecture, but they do a lot of urban design,
Right.
landscape, maybe not enough, but it's not so that the categories aren't as tidy as the professional associations might imply. And so in a way, it was sort of acknowledging something that I believe and stepping up and into it.
You knew why I asked that question. You started hinting at my next question in that answer, because I mean, I don't want to be too reductive here and ask you about the differences between design and architecture, but I do think that there's this blurriness that we're seeing, or an increased blurriness between the disciplines, and that these words are becoming much more elastic, perhaps, than they used to be. And I'm interested in how you think about interdisciplinarity, about, I don't know how you'd say, the increased mandate or the expanded opportunities for designers of all forms today, and how that sort of influences some of this thinking.
So I would disagree with you slightly. I don't think that we're more interdisciplinary than we have been. In other words, I think that you can look to the early 20th century and speak to a broad interdisciplinarity of architecture or of design broadly. And so I think that what's shifted are the mediums available to us, mediums
That's right.
and techniques and platforms. And so I think that's clear. Interdisciplinarity is at my core. That if you came to design thinking sort of through design and sort of with some, it sounds like, frustrations with design as a single practice, I came to design from interdisciplinarity.
Okay.
And so I absolutely embrace it and see it as a natural fit. I also see it as at once natural in a university, and yet also still not fully understood or let's say cultivated or vetted or promoted by the university system. And so I see interdisciplinarity as still the core challenge of our university system in the US.
That's exactly what I was thinking about, because I feel like, and I'm not too familiar with the structure of the GSD, but I in many of the schools I've been a part of or have visited or have talked with people, there is a lot of language around interdisciplinarity, and then when it actually gets on the ground, it becomes a lot more territorial, and that there are a lot sort of stronger boundaries. And so there are things where, after you go through the core classes at Harvard, classes are no longer sort of labeled by discipline. Can you sort of talk about that and how that encourages some of this that you're talking about?
Yeah, and I would say that the challenge of interdisciplinarity exists in 2 different forms. So it exists in one form at the school, and then it exists in a greater form, and one that maybe interests me even more as a challenge at the university scale. And so at the school scale, yes, we have distinct disciplines. We have accredited programs which are defined in part by their accrediting board. So, professional programs in architecture, in urban planning, and in landscape. And so, yes, there's a core curriculum that you need to gain to fulfill those expectations, but also to act as a designer and a practitioner in one of those disciplines, in one of those fields when you graduate. I love that the GSD has then all the courses beyond core, all the electives and option courses don't have a direct affiliation with a department, even though they do, because every faculty member has a direct affiliation with a department. So it's but it signals, and I think in a very profound way, that there is this mixing that happens at that level. In reality, that mixing is difficult, and in part because even if you've done your core discipline, for someone in landscape to take an advanced studio that's primarily about a building, unless they've had an architecture background, that can be super challenging. And so we find that the best interdisciplinary studios, advanced studios or option studios, are those that are very conscious about either marrying two faculty members from two different departments or taking on a problem that has different components that people can attack from their different fields of expertise and learn from each other, but not pretend that they actually understand everything about the other discipline.
I want to read something that you wrote in your welcome letter when you became the dean back in, this was dated July 1st, 2019. This is, I think, the first, if you go to your byline on the GSD website and go to the first published from you,
which I never do.
Well, I want to read this to you because I feel like if I wanted to, we could have a whole conversation about this paragraph. There's so much in here. But you write, and I quote, "Our days and semesters are filled with indispensable tools that live under headings like research, history, theory, policy, and technology. These tools shape and rattle our respective pursuits across the field of design. They also connect our departments and programs to each other, and more ambitiously allow us to assert an elastic constellation signaling our greater ambitions as citizens in a world that has never needed us more, a world that taunts us with its promise even as it shows us its jagged edges." And that's a lot of what we've been talking about already, this elasticity, this sort of interdisciplinarity. I want to zero in on this second part for a second about our greater ambitions as citizens in a world that has never needed us more, a world that taunts us with its promise, even as it shows us its jagged edges. And I also want to note this was written in 2019, before COVID, before the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, before all of the sort of cultural upheaval that we've seen in the last couple of years. And can you talk about why you think the world has never needed designers more, or the role of architecture and design in this world that taunts us with its jagged edges?
Yeah, I would love to talk about that more. So I think, yes, that was written before COVID and before Black Lives Matter, but it's not like we weren't in a milieu that was already difficult in terms of economic disparity, in terms of environmental crisis, and in terms of already understanding the frustration of civil rights not having, and women's rights and gay rights not having been achieved, right? So I think that even if it wasn't quite as acute a moment of collective understanding, it was still a moment of crisis. I think the world needs designers for a very obvious reason, which is well, actually, I'll give you three reasons. One is that we organize the world around us, whether at the scale of graphic design, organizing information, whether at the scale of planning, where you organize the city around you, whether at the scale of architecture, where you're organizing spaces and rooms, and so on. And so we have a very direct effect on how people live together in the world. So that, and understand the world, to speak to graphic design, which I don't deal with at our school, but I am fascinated
Maybe
by.
we should talk about that too.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. And so that's one reason. The second, and I often say this, is that the beauty of a design education is that you learn to work and to explain your work both verbally and visually. So that's incredibly powerful, especially in this moment when both of those media writ large, both of those body of media are quite powerful. And so, I think that, so my twin brother is at the law school. They outdo us on the verbal, but they fall behind us on the visual. And so, I think that that's amazing. And then the third is that I actually think everyone needs to engage the world right now. I think that we can't, and so when I say that we need to act as citizens in the world and engage our problems, I don't think that's just people in the design school. And I also think that that's actually something that is understood by students today in any discipline.
Something I talk about with my students a lot, and sort of a definition of design that I've come to uh, adopt and repeat endlessly, is I see design as ideology made artifact. It takes ways of seeing, points of view, opinions, and it makes it concrete in some way. It gives it structure. It gives it something that we can point to. And I'm wondering, if that resonates with you at all. It seems like it's speaking to a little bit of what you're talking about, especially sort of comparing it with your brother in the law school. Um, Although I guess you could argue that law also makes ideology concrete in a different way.
Oh yeah, very decisively so.
Yeah. And I'm wondering how you sort of bring those ideas into a classroom and start to connect those with form, connect those with building, connect those, how do you sort of talk about connecting the ideology with the actual artifact? Because I think we know that intuitively, but it's sometimes hard to show those direct connections. I'm wondering how you sort of think about that and go about that.
I mean, it's interesting. I like your characterization of making ideology into artifact. I think ideology is a difficult word right now because I think it's so calcified, or the implication is that it's calcified, that it's belief systems that are so formed. And so terms like elastic and nimble are ones that I constantly refer to and return to. And I wonder if there's a better term for something that, because what I like about your characterization is I actually do think that you have to commit. You have to have a belief system. You have to think through the repercussions of what you're doing and how they play out. So you can't be unthinking, and you can't have, it's too easy to shy away from taking a stance. And that's part of what the Doppler was about. But I wonder if ideology might be a bit of a tricky word right now, particularly.
Totally.
So that's one thing. But I do think that that's a good characterization. How that goes into the classroom, well, actually, the second part of your question, sort of how do you maintain, keep a foot in ideology and a foot in form, is critical. And I think that's to me the greatest challenge of a design school, because frankly, as you know, teaching design, there's nothing more fun. It is, I go into the trays, which is our big space where all the studio desks are, and it is a beehive of intense activity, models, drawings, imagining different futures. There's nothing more powerful than that. But if you don't challenge every student to say, what does this lead to, and why is this important, and how does it fit into a lineage that precedes you? I think 3 really critical questions that every student needs to address. Or if you say, okay, I understand those ideas, but how are you going to actually manifest those? What happens? And for us, so I know, I listened to your podcast with Andres. I guess that was your most recent one. I think that, I agree. I'm absolutely invested in the political, and maybe that's a better word than ideological. But I also think that we have to acknowledge that we're, as designers, we're already implicated by every line that we put on paper. Or every wall that we design, or every grade change we make in a landscape, and that those have political repercussions, and you can't shy away from those. And so, having come to design from interdisciplinarity and cultural theory, I was one of those students who was really good at talking about a project and frustrating my faculty, who were like, okay, well, show me. So I'm very sympathetic to students who are in that role. But I do think that that's our obligation, because otherwise if we only float around the ideas and the politics in an abstract way, we send students out and they are disillusioned by the exigencies of practice, which I suspect you were. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by your sort of distinguishing and talking about your own history. You sort of distinguish an intellectually rich milieu from the practice milieu. And I would say, you know, if we're going to change the world out there, part of what we have to change is to ensure that practice maintains an intellectually rich component.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think part of, not to then, go back through my history again, I think part of that was just being too young to understand how to actually be a practicing designer like yourself, who was really interested in ideas. And then it was like, okay, well, how do you make something out of this? That was sort of, I didn't know how to bridge that gap. And I also think a lot of graphic design is very sort of quick and responsive. And,
It's very fast.
and when you're working with clients and on projects, there often just isn't time for sort of deep thinking or reflection on the projects, which I sort of always found frustrating, which is what you're saying with, if you only talk about the ideas and then students go into work, that's sort of a hard adjustment. And I don't know if I have a question here.
No, but I want to actually jump in, because
Okay.
I think that you put on the table exactly part of the problem, which is this question of time, which is a subtopic that fascinates me and I keep returning to as a topic. And that's partly because yes, we live in a world that has accelerated further and further. There's actually now a theory of acceleration, which I find brilliant. And also sort of a little frustrating that there seems to be a theory about everything. But I think that the reality that our world happens very quickly, and we do have, as practitioners, we don't have much time to think,
Right.
is something that we have to push back at in the profession, as opposed to saying, then we all turn to academia, because I think that is part of what creates this divide. And so I would set as an example Irma Bohm, whose work is behind you, because
Right.
it took how many years to do that Sheila Hicks book?
Right.
That was extraordinary story to say, no, this takes time to actually mine this work and find the right way of translating it and showcasing it, but also making a project out of it. And so, she's a practitioner who I think really just sort of holds fast to as much time as a project needs.
Let me flip that back on you for a second. As a dean, you've been dean at Harvard since 2019. You mentioned already you were at Rice before that for 9 years. That's an intense job. Managing multiple departments, managing, all of the students, faculty, curriculum, budgets, all the administration. How do you think about time in your work, and how do you sort of balance that? I'm making divides and binaries again, which I don't mean to do, but sort of that administration work with that sort of research and thinking that so clearly excites you.
Yeah.
How do you think about that sort of in your day to day?
So couple things. One, I would say I don't have a good balance, and so I'm not a good model. Part of that is trying to tackle. So this school grew very, very quickly over a short period, and the faculty didn't grow at the same pace, which is typical for schools that grow. And so the administration was working hard to keep pace. And so a lot of things are being done the same way they were being done when I taught here before in the early 2000s. And yet it's not sustainable. And so I think, and that's a design, there's the operation of a school is a design problem in its own right.
That was my next question. Yeah.
And but one that's extremely hard to tackle, because it requires getting everyone to realize we all need to take time and rethink and also adapt to new ways of working. And so in a way, you could say the pandemic helped. I don't know if I want that to stay in as a comment, but it gave us different ways of working very quickly, and it proved to us that we can work differently.
Right.
We also hired someone right before the pandemic or during the pandemic. I can't remember now when we brought him on board, Sebastian Schmidt-Dalzone, who has the patience to think about things, processes, much more, and also the patience to look at different tools and the belief in data and tools that I don't necessarily share. So he's able to approach things and say, what if we do it this, in which, so I think having people around you, he's just one of many staff members who have taken the time to think, okay, this is a way we could do this better. And they're better at that than I am. And so you need to be able to find the people who can do that and nurture them and give them the time and space and support. But we haven't cracked it yet. So we're still changing things and trying to improve things. And in terms of my own time, there are two things. So one, I realize that I'm someone who works very horizontally, that I have short attention spans. I'm not a great person for a long project. And so I actually, I thrive even by being slightly distracted by many things that I can take care of at once.
Oh, this makes me feel better about myself. No, I'm the same. I'm the same way.
But having said that, I'm aware that can also, you can let the little projects distract you into thinking you're getting things accomplished. And I am aware that I need, and so I have a very good team in my office, my own administrative team, who are very good about saying, here's help in taking care of these gazillion emails, but you still haven't done this, which you promised, 10 days ago. And so you need a sort of little, a kind guilt factor to help push you along.
I love how you describe being a dean as a type of design project. I'm very interested in administration and institutions. I've talked to many deans and administrators who have all said, versions of that. And so I want to sort of ask you, like, maybe a higher level version of the previous question, how being at Harvard, how being a dean influences all the other work that you do, the work in your studio, the research and the writing that you do. What's impressed me about your tenure so far is you've seemed to have maintained a writing practice and you've been publishing. I mean, it's never as much as
exactly.
we want.
I think that's something to accept.
But how do you think sort of having to operate as a dean with those, administrative tasks that you were just talking about, and having a team that handles your emails and all of that, has that changed how you run a studio or how you do research or your research interests? How do those start to be in dialogue with each other?
So no, I mean, I think that there are very good deans who are very good at delegating and assembling teams. I've never been good at having a team help me with my research. I have had a lot of students over the years help me with my research, and I'm indebted to them for finding material or for checking material or for formatting my dossier or things like that. But honestly, I'm not that good at, because I tend to work. I also sort of love the part of writing where you essentially have the time to get lost in other topics that are to the side of what you write. So I tend to spend way too much time on the first paragraph of anything I write because I'm exploring many different things.
Yeah.
And I find that a kind of intellectual luxury. So I'm not that good at that. And I will, just as a side note, my team that helps me organize my emails, they're only the dean emails, and I still play a heavy role in them. And so I believe a lot in the personal voice. So I'm not, I would be more effective or more efficient if I delegated more of my own work. And it's just not the way I work. And so I admire those who do, but that's, or I look at, I'm very familiar with people at the ATA in Zurich, and they have whole teams of people who work with them. And that's a great way of getting big projects done. But again, one of the luxuries I have for my writing, maybe one change you could say is, right now I can just do the projects that I think actually mean something to me. Though I still do get asked to write like a preface for a friend's book, and they mean a lot to me, so I tend to say yes. And then I find myself wondering sort of, why am I saying yes to all of these? Because they're
familiar,
pleasurable, but they're distracting. So that's one thing.
Does it, what about like the types of projects that you take on, or the types of topics that you do want to write about in your own sort of intellectual interests? Do you think being in a position of dean, being able to see all the things happening at Harvard, has that changed like your interest in architecture, or what interests you about architecture at all?
No, I don't. I really don't think that first of all, I don't think of myself all the time as a dean. I sort of often, like, I'll walk out of the building and I'll go through the lobby and someone will hold the door open and I'll say, thank you. And they'll say, oh yes, of course, for the dean. And I'll be like, oh my God, do they really think of me like that? Because I forget, and it's going to sound disingenuous, but it's easy to forget that that's a big title, especially at a school like this.
Right. Interesting.
And so, I think that my interests in writing projects or in thinking about things have not changed a whole lot since I was maybe even in college. And so yes, I have, I don't know. I guess I have access to a lot of interesting interlocutors here. And that's one thing, Harvard is extraordinary for the people who come through and inspire. I think I often get, this is why I like listening to podcasts, and we can talk about that more. And I particularly like listening to interview podcasts because I get inspired by little things that send you off into thinking about things differently. And Harvard for unbelievable. The people who come through the GSD, or the people who come through the university, or my colleagues across the university or within the school, you're constantly provoked intellectually, and that is so rich. So that is definitely true.
I feel like we're just everything you're saying, I'm like, oh, this is exactly how I feel about these things. I'm not just saying that, so I'm talking to you. But I'm the same way. I don't actually listen to that many podcasts. But the ones that I do listen to are long form freewheeling interviews like I do on the show, for that same reason. It's like, I never know where it's going to go. And just sort of hearing two smart people talk about something is endlessly fascinating and generative.
Because I think actually conversation is, for me, a part of the intellectual project, and it's a very important part of the school. And so for me, and that's in part why I'm constantly referring to podcasts, or encouraging students to listen to them, because I think that we live in a moment when a lot of information is pre-digested and then delivered. And then you have smart people, or people who can recite data or sound bites to you. But I'm more interested in smart people who can converse, so who pay attention to what's being said and then who build on an idea, which is why I'm super excited about our student publication called Pairs. Have you seen that?
Yeah, just a little bit. I've seen just a little bit of it.
It's an interview format that's also about a subject and an object, and so it's a double pairing. And the interview format, I think, is fantastic for students and has been really valuable for, this is a format that I think is really important to promote when interviews are thoughtful, which is why I think some of the podcasts, it tends to be long form podcasts that I think are more valuable.
I mean, not to get too meta here, but that's sort of the driving ambition for me. Is it's like monologue. I'm sort of tired of hearing monologues. The people who go up at the podium, they have their slides. It's fully scripted. This is much more interesting because I'm getting to hear. I've watched a bunch of talks that you did to prepare for this. But today, right now, I'm hearing you say things you've never said before, or never said publicly that I've been able to find. And we wouldn't have gotten that any other way.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think it's so and when I was at Rice, I taught a class at Rice that was based on the interview format. So we would invite 4 speakers as part of the public lecture series, and students would prepare read background work about those 4 speakers in the seminar, and then the morning after their talk, the students would interview. And the format was they had to submit a long version of a question and a short version of a question.
Oh, interesting.
Acknowledging that conversation isn't always controllable, but if there's something you really want to get in there, you have to have 2 ways of slipping it in as a question.
Yeah.
And the rule was everyone had to speak. Everyone had to get a question on the table in the seminar with the guest. And that was a phenomenal format.
That's a great idea.
Really sort of encouraging students to learn how to converse and have an exchange with these people who they put on pedestals, but then they could realize we're actually really normal people.
I want to sort of shift a little bit and talk about editing for a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
Because
that's the other way I characterize being a dean, is it's like being an editor.
Well, that's what I was thinking. You've been editing almost your entire career also, and so much of what you're talking about sounds, I've done some editing also, and thinking about conversation. You mentioned earlier this idea of personal voice being important. The way you were talking about Dean sounded like editing. How has being an editor sort of influenced your thinking on this, or how is editing sort of its own type of design practice? Maybe
that's the best way of characterizing it. I love editing,
and
when I edit both. I do line editing and idea editing at the same time, because I'm very and I see it as a design project, because I love beautifully crafted writing, and at the same time, I push for it has to actually say something, right? And I do see the same thing. So I love the editing work that I do. It is a material process in a way, and deaning is a very similar thing. Essentially, a good editor is helping take a piece of writing and have it shine. It's sort of burnishing off the edges that don't work. And it's the same thing when you're a dean. It's trying to you essentially want to enable your faculty to shine, and so it's nudging. Okay, what if you do this way, or what if you recognize that you're spending time on that and that's actually not helping you, or things like that. So it's mainly the faculty, but the school as a whole. And so, I see it as very similar. It's a sort of, backstage, but I like editor better than director, because I think an editor enables something to be, you don't look at a book's editor first, you look at the author. Right. And I think acknowledging that a good dean shouldn't be the autocrat, but should be the enabler. I hate that word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense to me. Can you talk a little bit more about how you think about editing as a design process? I've taught writing classes to graphic designers a lot, and I spend a lot of time talking about how so much of the vocabulary between the two are similar. And we talked before we were recording about my interest in sort of the overlap of graphic design and writing. But they're both about sort of giving ideas for, it's going back to that ideology artifact thing. It's giving it a shape. But then you're thinking about structure, you're thinking about rhythm, you're thinking about pacing, all of the things. You're thinking about hierarchy, you're thinking about how someone moves through audience. How do you sort of think about that? Or are there overlaps between editing, or we could even say writing generally, and sort of architectural practice?
Yeah, no, I think there are. And I think part of it is that I think the most successful writing is writing that understands its audience and its medium, but ideally can speak to a broader audience than that one. And so, this is where, say, writing in the Atlantic or the New Yorker tends to be writing that can speak to many different registers. I just had our PhD pro seminar in the spring semester this semester, which Ed Eigen is teaching, is bringing in different members of the PhD faculty, and we're supposed to talk about our own methods. And I used it as a chance to talk about different writing formats and how one has to be conscious of, like, when you're writing something, what is it being published in, and what does that mean? And the pleasure of that, and maybe the fact that I've been a little bit freewheeling in too many different formats and audiences, and the risk of that, let's say. But I think that I think that editing is crafting. It is like building. I think partly it's to you're also constantly listening to what a text is, so that it's you have a sense of what it's like to hear it. This is also why I'm anticipating your final question, which of course I know, but I like listening to books, but I have very specific issues with that, with audiobooks or with audio podcasts. So we'll talk about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that at the end. I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I've heard you tell this story a couple times, but I'm reminded of it when you were just talking about writing there, about how when you were in 8th grade, you wrote this 10-page paper on the history of architecture.
History of architecture.
Yeah.
And an interview with an architect. I mean, it was amazing.
And so like that's so much of what you're talking about has been there your whole life. I'm thinking about, your early career working for Eisenman and Koolhaus, who are two sort of practitioner theorists. It's interesting to me that this sort of theory and practice relationship, this interest in writing, this interest in editing, all of this has been there from the beginning. I have two questions about that. Do you have thoughts on where that came from, or why that? This goes back to your earlier comment about sort of coming into architecture through interdisciplinarity, how that happened. And then the second question is how that has then shaped what you have gone on to do, this sort of constant oscillating between these.
So if you've heard that story, and I will note that, I wrote that paper in 8th grade, and my twin brother wrote a paper about law. And so, our Mrs. Masick was very prescient, our 8th grade teacher.
You were in the same class too?
We're in middle school. We were in the same, in 8th grade specifically, we were in the same class, and in a school where my mother taught, actually. So that's a whole story in itself. But where did that come from? I mean, I'm interested in. I've always been interested in. This is. I've also said this, and it sounds kind of naive, maybe, but I'm extremely interested in the fact that there are billions and billions of people in the world, and we share so many things, and we yet are so different. And so this is why I like the art of conversation, and the interview is seeing ideas evolve from the connection between people. It's why I like design, because it actually puts people in connection with other people. And so that is maybe the sort of glue of what marks, like, I'm all over the place, but actually I realize that's a constant.
Being all over the place is the constant, you mean?
No, what's a constant is an interest in how people deal with one another, is in broad terms. And then the second is, as you've probably also heard, I wanted to be the critic of the New York Times, or actually the International Herald Tribune, based in Paris. And so I still see, that makes sense to me still, as I like short form writing. I like journalism as a venue that speaks to a broader audience. I like the idea that architecture has a broad audience that needs, that can be engaged by that. And so that's also a constant. but then there's the academic side. I mean, I grew up in an academic family. All of us now, all the kids are
Right.
affiliated with universities. We're all kind of geeky and not very rebellious. So we all ended up nice academics as well as a couple professional practitioners.
As we head into the end of this conversation, I want to pick up something you just said about, you wanting to be the architecture critic for the New York Times. And we've been talking a lot about sort of design media or design discourse, or talking around it throughout
Yeah.
this conversation. I'm curious sort of your thoughts on the state of design discourse and publishing and writing today. I mean, I think I'll give you my sorry, I hate doing this. I'll give
Sure.
you my thought first, and
Sure.
just to sort of maybe start that dialogue a little bit. I hear so often that there are not enough places to write about design, and that's specifically a graphic design sort of argument, that the major newspapers don't have critics anymore, that we're sort of in this crisis of criticism, which feels like a thing that we've just been hearing about forever, and maybe
Mhm.
we have been hearing about forever. Yet there's also more opportunities to write about design than ever before. All sorts of publications, like you
Sure.
said, The Atlantic is covering design in sort of obscure in different ways. There's sort of upstart publications that have an influence and are building an audience, and there's this sort of like, I don't know, it's almost like a collapsing and rebuilding that we're seeing right now, where a lot of those big the single critic is no longer a thing that matters, and there's now this sort of variety. um what do you think about sort of design writing today and design discourse today?
That's a big question. I mean, I think what you've outlined is true, and is a reality that one can't really lament. Though, boy, hearing the NPR laid off so many, what is it, 10% of its
Yeah,
workforce or
yeah,
more.
100 people.
Um,
Yeah.
it's frightening, I think, to see. I'm fascinated by watching what the New York Times has done to stay relevant and
Mhm.
stay in tune with new media, but they've invested a lot in it, and it's risky. And I think, I applaud them for the different ways they've been keeping a pace, because I do think that there's still a value to having, let's say, the big formats
Right.
present and strong enough. And I think even having critics with names that we can bandy about and sort of know their perspective, so that we can position ourselves in relationship to them, is
Right.
valuable for cultural discourse. And so, I think that if people say, oh, well, it's great that we don't have that kind of authoritarian overview, I actually think that's a pity. And so the
Huh.
loss of the critic and the
Right.
absence of architectural criticism specifically, but design, I would say that the built environment criticism
Yeah.
is the real loss, because I think that, especially in the US, so much of the built environment is so controlled by large capital. It seems like it's a force on its own and can't be either understood or intersected or interfered with. And I think the more that the public understands, the more they can actually voice their opinion. And I think
Mhm.
that level of opinion politics at a very local scale is actually very valuable. And so, I think that's a big crime. Having said that, yes, there are a lot of new formats. There are a lot of valuable ones. I would give a shout out in particular to the New York Review of Architecture, which I think is a fantastic new
They're doing such
publication.
great work. Yeah.
Very, very good work. And I love that they play with different formats of columns within
Hmm.
one issue. But I think that speaks to a small audience. And I think the proliferation of formats is great, but the fact is that just is part of our uh,
Yeah.
world becoming a series of niche audiences.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I was thinking about the comment you made earlier about the sort of separation between kind of academia and practice. And,
Yeah.
the people who get frustrated with that, they go into academia, and it sort of furthers that. And it seems like in some way this speaks to that also. It's just, that speaks to this need, or your sort of desire for those critics, because that can sort of speak across those audiences in some way, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think, there ideally there can be additional platforms. It's why I always ask people what podcasts they listen to or what websites they go to, because I think we're always searching for, and I keep paring down my podcast list, but I keep thinking, am I missing like the one that will actually be the one I count on? And the same with newsletters or
Yep. Yep.
websites. And I think that's um, I that's something that I think, I try and explain to students. It's very important to figure out what sources you're relying on and that you want to contribute to, or you want to have be part of your worldview.
Right.
And I find that very exciting, but also very frustrating that those sources are proliferating and yet becoming a little bit invisible.
I think that's a really nice way. I have two more questions
Sure.
for you. The first
Yeah.
one, you know what the second one's going to be, apparently. But the first
It's
one
like
sort of
on mysteries, I tend to read the end. And
yeah.
I'm not really good with suspense.
This first question sort of speaks to what you were just talking about. Listening to all these podcasts, listening to these newsletters, encouraging students to do that. You've said a couple times that you're all over the place. You
Mhm.
thrive on distraction. You're interested in a lot of different things. What are you thinking about right now? What are the things that are interesting to you sort of right now? And that can be in architecture and design, or generally. What's getting you excited about, sort of intellectually excited right now?
Partly I'll wait till what I'm reading to explain that, but partly I can answer that. So Rahul Malhotra and I just edited the latest issue of the Harvard Design Magazine on today's Global, and that I find that's just like a toe in a very important topic today. And I would say that intellectually, I'm very interested in how we operate at different scales and how we can
Mm,
be effective at different scales. And so I've long been interested in the scale of the sort of the common, but not the neighborhood. So I'm interested
mm,
in how people come together, as I've said several times now, but I'm not interested in self-similarity, which is why I find sort of neighborhood fetishization
yeah.
uh, is a
Oh,
little makes me nervous
that's
because it's
so
essentially
interesting.
people who are comfortable with other people who are like themselves
Right.
or in their little world, their little bubbles. And we have an intellectual version of neighborhoods happening today that speaks a little bit to what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in how today's global can help break that and not pull someone away from the importance of the local, which is, I think, where we can be most effective politically,
Yeah.
uh, but can still recognize the value of our global environment. So I guess different scales, and I think that is actually a result of being at the GSD, where in part you're constantly pulled to different scales in terms of if you look at the, I don't know, 33 option studios that we have this semester. I can't remember how many it is. It's crazy number of studios.
Yeah.
The range of topics is a range of scales and range of questions. And so I would say that's a topic that I'm intrigued by right now.
I'm mad that I asked you that at the end, because I feel like I have 20 questions that we could talk about just with that. So
That's the
here's
beauty of a podcast, because that's ideally this should get you thinking, and actually it also helps me to actually say that out loud. So
here's the last question, which I guess you know already. What are you reading right now?
yeah, no, I toyed with not telling the truth on this one, because what I'm going to answer sounds very uh um maybe a little overly academic and makes me really nerd out. So I am
I love how
reading.
you're like thinking like branding purposes here. Like, how
Yeah,
is this going to
exactly.
make me come across? Like,
I
does this
know
fit my
exactly.
brand?
No, this really does. So first of all, I thrive on fiction.
Me too.
It's very important to me, and in part because I love crafted writing,
Hmm.
but it also is a way I'm very interested in fiction that illuminates again relationships between people or ways that people interact with other people. And so um, my touchstone literature, like the one that explains what I'm always interested in, but I'm not reading right now, is Simone de Beauvoir's
Oh yeah.
Woman Destroyed, which I think is an extraordinary slim novella that explicates how we can never know someone who we think we know very well. So I'll leave that one at that. I recommend it to everyone. But right now I'm reading Karl Ove Knausgaard's most recent book, which is Morning Star.
Yeah.
And I'm reading that one. And then I'm listening to Emmanuel Carrère's The Kingdom, and I'm listening to it in French. And so, which is Le Royaume. And so two things. They're actually they really overlap because Carrère and Knausgaard are both uh, these figures who you can't really categorize in one genre, and they really mix autobiography
Yeah.
and fiction in ways that I think are very interesting. There are also two people who I think I would find insufferable in real life. They're equally narcissistic and overtly so. But I find them both fascinating for actually understanding someone who I wouldn't necessarily like in real
Mm,
life and understanding their perspective. But I also think they're both incredible writers.
right.
The Carrère I'm listening to in part to practice my French. My mother was French, and I try to maintain it. And he is narrating it. They're both super long books, which is frustrating. So this is in fact I think the third time I've been reading Le Royaume. I've read it, the physical book. I've listened to it, but I've never gotten through the whole thing.
Okay.
And just because it's so long, but he narrates very beautifully. He has very clear French, and I think he's
Mm,
a sort of fascinating figure. The Knausgaard is so I read My Struggle, and I really found it quite amazing. I think this is a very beautifully written book, and I'm kind of fascinated by his going into a different format than that. The
right.
6 tomes of gazillion pages about himself. So
Yeah, I haven't read those yet. They're one of those. It's like I'll get to those someday.
yeah,
I
number
don't know when.
two is I think the best one, but I do actually think it's very beautiful writing, and they both Carrère and Knausgaard are able to talk about the everyday, but also very philosophical topics. The
Yeah.
Kingdom is actually I mean I don't know if you I don't know if you know his writing generally. So
I'm aware of it. You know, I've read bits and pieces, but not. I've not spent a lot of time.
he wrote the first book that Carrère wrote that I was attracted to was called The Moustache, and it's about a guy who one day decides to shave off his mustache, and his wife doesn't notice, and his good friends don't notice, and he starts to wonder if he ever had one. And he descends into it. I mean, it's a very short book, and it's very beautifully written.
Okay.
And then the Kingdom is hugely long and is it's a sort of novelization of the first decades of the Christian church.
Okay.
So he's essentially taking on Luke, and
Okay.
uh, but it's also an autobiography of his own
Oh,
um,
interesting.
religious beliefs and then his discarding of his religion. So it's essentially saying, how is it that all these people believe this story of Christ, and why is that held for so long, and why is this shared belief, which I find fascinating as a um, and the Knausgaard is also sort of talks about belief or different people's beliefs. And it's not a question so much of faith, but I think I'm very interested in issues of people's beliefs and again, relationships among people. And both of them are authors who are very good at capturing that.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I think that sort of sums up so much of what we've been talking about today, actually. Sarah, I feel like I could talk to you all day. This has been such a delight. I've enjoyed this so much.
I've been really enjoying your conversations with others, so I knew that it would be a lot of fun to talk with you. I appreciate the podcast a lot. And
thank you so much, and thanks for your time, and thanks for being on the show.
Absolutely.
This episode was recorded on February 24th, 2023. Our theme music is by Andy Wargasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.